Welcome to this webinar on policy spaces for social ecological transformation, which is part of a webinar series with the title of Beyond Globalization and Deglobalization. My name is Andreas Novy. I'm working at the Vienna University of Economics and Business and president of the International Karl Polanyi Society. And I will host this event together with Ulrich, professor for political science at the Department of Political Science in Vienna, well known for his work on social ecological transformation and for our debate of special interest and relevance that he has coined together with Markus Wissen the term imperial mode, or the concept imperial mode of living. And he will, as I said, co-facilitate with me this event. To start with, it's a joint event by several organizations: the International Karl Polanyi Society, the Department for Political Science at the University of Vienna, the EuroMemo Group, the FH, this BFI-Wien, a university in Vienna, the Institute for Multi-Level Governance and Development at WU, the Institute of Sociology at Johannes Kepler University in Linz, the Mattersburger Kreis für Entwicklungspolitik an den österreichischen Hochschulen und ÖFSE, the Austrian Foundation for International Development. I'm very happy that these events have been supported by the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation in Brussels. Yeah, these are the formalities, and thank you. And this event is only possible because several organizations worked together. It is the last webinar in a series of webinars which started last December, where we discussed an article that I've written in the journal Globalization called The Political Trilemma of Social Ecological Transformations, Lessons from Karl Polanyi's The Great Transformations. Great Transformation. It was continued with a discussion with Daniel Rodrik, because my trilemma is inspired and criticizing his trilemma at the Polanyi conference in Montreal. It was a virtual conference, but organized by the Polanyi Center in Montreal. And finally, in July, a webinar in search for planetary coexistence. And this webinar, which took place 2 months ago, it focused, and kind of the key result and agreement of the people participating was we need multi-scalar policies and strategies. That means strategies that focus at different spatial levels, and the challenge is how to best combine them. This webinar is a very ambitious webinar. It focuses on the text I've just, we have discussed in webinars before, but on second text by Ulrich, that he was the key author, but he co-authored this with several others, I think in total 28 persons. I am one of the co-authors as well, and Miriam is one of the co-authors as well. And in a few minutes, they will present this article. And the idea is to enter in a dialogue between the reflections on space, power, and transformation in Polanyi and my text, with the reflections that strongly emerge out of concerns for social ecological transformation. This said, I think I can hand over to Uli, who will give a short introduction on this article before handing over to our key three discussants.
Yes, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. Also from my side, I'm very happy that this webinar takes place. First of all, many thanks to Andreas, Novy, and the Carl Society for the initiative to the series of webinars and also to this very particular one and on these highly relevant topics. And many thanks to Melissa also for the wonderful support and the preparation of this seminar. So I would like to contextualize a bit the paper Andreas was mentioning, and then Miriam will go into detail and also will contextualize us a bit in her background, which is Latin America and Latin American debates. Since 2014, a group of people, which was very contingent, it was not a fixed group of people, we met every other year at the International Degrowth Conferences, 2014 in Leipzig, 2016 in Budapest, and 2018 in Malmö. And we always offered workshops on the quite important debate on planetary boundaries. And we were also surprised that there was such strong interest in these workshops. And at the after the third one, we decided to write a paper. Another institutional context was that at the University of Vienna in Germany, the Schiller University, at this time, a research group on post-growth societies was established during 8 years, and this was kind of a hub that many of our co-authors had a chance to participate there as fellows, to be there as fellows, to participate at conferences and workshops there. And so we decided in 2019 to start a writing process. And this took more than 2 years, as Andreas said, 28 scholars from 14 countries, from the global north and the global south, senior scholars, junior scholars, and it would be a research project on its own to get all the comments, to review again all the comments we got during this writing process. The paper is very long, it's doubled as long as a usual academic paper, but it was 3 or 4 times as long, and so we of course cut it down, and I think that we can contribute to the debate. The second context, of course, is the very, very important debate since 2009 on planetary boundaries. The papers that were published by Rockström et al., then there were updates, and in the later papers, they from 2015 and others, the authors from this planetary boundaries framework claim, for example, that there is an uneven distribution of causes and benefits that must be addressed, and that the planetary boundaries framework and research in this context should focus more on societal boundaries. And we, as authors, took this as an invitation to reflect a bit more, and in our title we have the concept of societal boundaries to elaborate this and to contribute to this debate. And the third context, of course, is the deepening of the multiple crises. The planetary framework, the planetary boundaries framework touches on a very, very important dimension, which is the ecological crisis, but we have also the crisis of production and reproduction. We have the crisis of representation, of democracy, of a growing north-south divide, and we argue in the paper that we should also deal with this, of course, focusing on planetary and societal boundaries, but societal boundaries are not only necessary because we have the planetary boundaries, but also because we have these other crisis dimensions. So from a perspective of critical social science, we have also some scientists from social ecology, for example, Helmut Haberl and Anke Schafazik from the Institute of Social Ecology in Vienna and others. Our proposal, and the first part is about the strengths and weaknesses of the planetary boundaries framework, but then our first proposal is to reinvent a broad notion of capitalism. We have several dimensions. How do we understand a capitalism? Of course, in the paper, it's an as I said, we offer a discussion with our colleagues, and our main point is that capitalism, understood in a very, very broad sense, also referring to Karl Polanyi's work, the main problem is the capitalist growth imperative, that there's a permanent escalation of resource use, of the overuse of resources that capitalism works. the capitalist mode of production, and that this produces permanent lock-ins, institutional lock-ins, mental lock-ins, psychological lock-ins, lock-ins due to certain power relations, etc., that hinder the social ecological transformations. And then in another part, we update, or we take again a dimension which was very important in the 1970s, which is the concept of self-limitation, collectively organized and collectively agreed self-limitation, which for us it's the key, a key aspect of societal boundaries. Miriam will go into detail. And in the last part of the paper, before some conclusions, which is more also some open questions, we want to make visible that there are already many existing alternatives, which what we call a pluriverse of alternatives. Some of our authors published a book, the Pluriverse, which outlines also the many existing alternatives in the world. So I leave it here as a brief outline and as a teaser of the text, and Miriam will take up only some points. It's a large article, we cannot go into detail. And what I want to do now is briefly introduce Miriam Lang. She is originally from Germany, but lives and works since many years in Latin America. She engaged and in one of the first, if you like, crystallization moments of an anti-neoliberal counter movement in the 1990s, the Zapatista rebellion in Chiapas, and which often we forget because we often argue the starting point of the alter globalization movement is in Seattle, the protests against the WTO. But no, I would say, and I was also very active at this time, it was a cornerstone was already in the 90s in Chiapas and in many other countries. Then after other alternatives, she was during some years director of the Quito office of Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And there she initiated a group. We just had our annual meeting last week, which is really great, a working group, Alternatives to Development, which brings together around 50 scholars, activists, ex-politicians to really think how the development imperative, if you like, the complement to the growth imperative in the global north, is so deeply inscribed in the imaginaries, in the practices in the global south. Since 8 years, Miriam works as a professor for environment and sustainability and at the Andean University, Simón Bolívar in Quito. And yeah, I'm very happy that you collaborated in the writing process. We already had also some other writings together, and I give you now the floor. Thank you, Miriam.
Thanks very much, Uli, for this fabulous introduction. Thanks to you, Andreas, for inviting me to this webinar, and to all the organizers for the work that has already flown into it. I'm really thrilled to share this room with such interesting thinkers like Ian Gough and Colleen Schneider. And also I'm very grateful to have been part of this process Uli just described, to produce the article about societal boundaries. I thought I should take a Latin American perspective on this concept of policy spaces for social ecological transformation, which Andreas chose as a subtitle for our webinar, and related to this horizon of societal boundaries. Because I have been struggling with the concept of policy spaces in the last days. I was trying to evaluate its potential in grasping and making visible what actually is going on with regard to social ecological struggles in Latin America. I will try to explain this because I think that if we do not understand the underlying reasons, we might weaken those other modes of living which we also refer to in our article on societal boundaries as existing alternatives, modes of living which have persisted at the margins of capitalist logics in regions like Latin America, not only. I am referring to indigenous, Afro-descendant, and peasant societies, which today acquire such an importance because they are accountable for roughly preserving and grooming 80% of still existing biodiversity. So we have an opportunity to learn from their ways of understanding the world, understanding their perspectives on well-being, on needs, understanding their way of framing interdependence with nature and enacting reciprocity, and also the quality of relations as a central feature of quality of life. So I think it's how we frame and understand strategies and policy spaces is relevant for our relationship with these modes of living, and whether we weaken them or strengthen them or learn from them or just erase them. Now, how do multi-level political intervention foster or hinder such a dialogue? Or how do they foster or hinder the very possibilities of existence of these groups? Regarding the concept of policy spaces, on the one hand, there is without doubt very useful literature that points out how the new rules and dynamics of neoliberal globalization, like the creation of the World Trade Organization, the reorganization of production around global value chains, have significantly restricted the policy space for countries in the global south. This is analyzed with regard to the possibilities of policies for development or industrialization, maybe, but I think it also, or even more, would apply to policies of transformation towards more social justice and sustainability. But this perspective leads to often to simple comparisons regarding the performance of states in the global south with those in the global north. For example, how do they perform with regard to ecological regulations, with regard to energy transitions? And I think this perspective falls short. Such a comparative approach assumes that the structural, formal, and institutional dimensions of politics, we could say the polities as such, are comparable in a country like, let's say, Germany, and on the other side, Ecuador or Brazil, for example. Of course, formally, at first glance, all of these countries, even Brazil today, still have electoral democracies, they have separation of powers, etc. But if we take a closer look, I think we can see huge differences in how existing institutions effectively protect and implement legal rights. In Ecuador, Ecuador has made headlines in 2008 because it constitutionalized the rights of nature. But then in 2013, the progressive government of Rafael Correa started to exploit oil in one of the most biodiverse hotspots of the world in the Ecuadorian Amazon, the Yasuni National Park. And 1 year later, in 2014, it even subordinated the Ministry of Environment to the Ministry of Non-Renewable Resources, turning it into a sort of bureaucratic.
It seems that Miriam has a problem. Unfortunately, we had a problem in preparation as well. I use the time as he is present to present the next speaker who will speak after Miriam returns and finishes her presentation. Ian Gough, he's visiting professor at London School of Economics. He was I've finished this. He was for many years working in Manchester at the Institute for Social Policy, and he's well known for his book that he wrote in 1991 with Len Doyle on a theory of human need. And from social policy, he shifted in the last, I think, 10 years or more to a social ecological transformation. And he has written this very important book, Heat, Greed and Human Need, Climate Change, Capitalism and Sustainable Development. And that was a key reason why we invited him. And he will speak after Miriam Lang has finished her presentation, and we are happy that you are back again.
Yes, so am I.
Go ahead and take your time.
Okay, thanks a lot, Andreas. I'm sorry, normally it works very straight and uninterruptedly. I don't know what's the matter today. So I was just about to say that Brazil's President Bolsonaro said before he took office, if I become president, there will not be a centimeter more of indigenous land. But these aggressions are not on indigenous modes of living, are not only advanced through legislation, which is actually undermining the constitution. And this kind of legislation is not only emerging now with Bolsonaro, but is being discussed since 2007, also under previous administrations. But it is they are also brought forward through the effects of infrastructural mega projects and through, for example, massive wildfires induced, for example, by cattle ranches or other interest groups, as you have seen in the last years. So whether such a constitutional protection effectively protects is very relative under practical Latin American conditions. And my third example is in January 2021, recently, the people of Cuenca in Ecuador, the third biggest city of the country, decided per referendum, and this is where I will show you 2 slides, that they did not want mining to happen in their water recharge zones, which are situated above the city in the Andean highlands. And the victory for the prohibition of mining in these landscapes was very clear. It was more than 80% who voted against it. But now we have a government, a national government, which is rather neoliberal, and which in August presented a new labor law, as you can see here in the slide. And the official event for introducing the new labor law was sponsored by one of the big transnational corporations, which has vested interests in the highlands above Cuenca, where this referendum prohibited mining. And the referendum supposedly has is constitutionally binding. Nevertheless, the government is already reverting it and its effect somehow. So why am I saying this? I think that in Latin American...
That's a pity.
You're again frozen, Miriam.
Yeah.
Andreas can introduce Colleen.
Yeah, we are very efficient here, saving time. Colleen Schneider, she will speak after Miriam, after Ian Gough. She's a PhD student at my university, Vienna University of Economics and Business at the Institute of Ecological Economics. She is a member of Degrowth Vienna, the main organizer of this huge Degrowth conference in Vienna on strategy in 2020. And since a few weeks, she has been board member of the International Karl Polanyi Society. Her PhD is on the political economy of monetary and fiscal policy and social ecological transformation. And that's why we invited her. And we are looking forward to your presentation later on. But fortunately, we have Miriam back.
Yes. Please excuse.
No, but that's yeah, that's the technique, and that's the planet we're living in, and you're far away. It's very exciting to have you that near. Yeah? But not all the time it's working. So
okay, we have made some changes here. I hope it will help. So what I was saying, that in the global south, in countries like, for example, Ecuador or Brazil, every single victory in terms of social ecological transformation has to be secured again and again, both at the regulatory level, but also in factual territorial struggles. in a sort of exhausting tugging over power relations. And I think this is a huge difference to countries like Germany or Britain, where certain frameworks simply give solid grounds to certain achievements of struggles. Now, of course, much has been said about that developing countries still lack their institutional capacities to consolidate their democracies, etc. But I think that these problems I just described are not about simply being at a different stage on a linear path to progress and democracy, and that they are not accurately described with this not yet discourse of institutional capacities. And I think maybe the recent successes in Afghanistan might have given us an eloquent lecture about that. Rather, this incremental discourse of state building makes invisible that there are historical reasons for the contrast between relative stability of institutional policy frameworks in the global north and their consistent instability in the global south. Those reasons, in my understanding, root in what Aníbal Quijano called the coloniality of power. According to this theory, different purposes and roles were assigned to different world regions in the emerging world system since the 16th century and the event of colonization. It could be said that since then, Latin America has had the role of providing raw materials toward other parts of the world, where those then were processed and later industrialized. Thus, states or political institutions had a different role to play in those peripheral regions than in the centers of the world system. In the first place, in the peripheries, they had to secure the appropriation of nature in the context of what has been called unequal ecological exchange, and also to secure the cheap, often even free, appropriation of labor, which was very effectively differentiated around the concept of race. So that determined who gets paid and who doesn't for their work according to which reason and which laws. Large parts of the population of these states have been excluded from access to all kinds of rights until very recently. For example, indigenous people in Ecuador only gained the right to vote in 1979, long after white women had achieved it in 1929. Meanwhile, in the global north, social struggles evolved generally around the conflict between capital and labor, mainly, not only, of course, and led to a successive expansion of rights and finally to welfare models. I think today we are quite familiar with the concept of unequal ecological exchange, with the fact that centuries of wealth transfer from the global south, from colonial to present times.
Maybe I can elaborate a bit the argument, because Miriam also should come to an end with her experiences, the argument of self-limitation. So we take up in the paper a debate introduced by Ivan Illich and André Gortz in the 70s. And our point is how to organize a society, the rules in a society, but also as desires, as societal practices. There we refer to Ian's work on consumption corridors and others, how to enable a decent life, but not at the expense of others and not at the expense of nature. And the challenge is to reorganize this and to counter the permanent escalation, the permanent growth imperative of our societies. And there we refer to consumption corridors, as I said, but also to the need to of an industry conversion, to really reorganize the whole production apparatus and others. However, and when you read the paper, there is an interesting tension in the paper that we argue with autonomy and the concept, of course, of autonomy and freedom in a sense which comes from below, which is organized at a societal level. But at the other hand, we might underestimate in the paper a bit what the question of rules, the question of concrete settings, of achievements which are then secured. And this is, Miriam, I just finished and make again a bridge, create a bridge to you. And this is why we think, when we think about policy space in the global north, we have these more stabilized institutional settings when we have the rules, for example, to change energy production and consumption, or to change the mobility system, or to change certain production systems. There is a durability, there is a certain continuity that we can promote with this social ecological transformations. And as Miriam argues, in the global south, it's permanently contested. Yeah. So the volatility of changes, the pushbacks, the rollbacks are much more visible. So this is, Miriam, I just outlined a bit our concept of self-limitation, and I ask you to come to an end of your presentation, and
yes,
that we then have the bridge, that we have the other. Thank you.
Okay. So yes, what I was saying is that we are less familiar with this idea that there might be an interrelation between the fragility of statehood in the global south and its stability, relative political stability in the global north. So it would not only have been since neoliberal globalization that those spaces in the north have been restrained, but they never really have been built in the first place. I think to come to an end, the pandemic in the last years had boosted debates about social ecological transformation, and there is a very visible shift toward, for example, decarbonization, which is being supported by political elites and also big corporate players. And what will happen at this moment of history will inevitably have profound repercussions on the global south in this historical relation of interdependence. And I think that from a Latin American perspective, the greatest concern regarding the recent dynamics of social ecological transformation might be that the direct effects of whatever choice is made on the global south are not being really discussed in the north, but again remain invisible. So whether countries in the north opt for degrowth strategies or rather for green growth is absolutely crucial for the possibilities of social justice and sustainable nature relations in the south, and for the existence of those alternative modes of living I mentioned at the beginning. And so I think that in our article about societal boundaries, we speak about the right to not live at the expense of others, which is an idea that I like very much, which is very important in our times. But I think that the challenge that the global north faces today is maybe also the challenge not to transform at the expense of others. And to understand that the interdependence that we have to incorporate in our strategies is not only between human societies and nature, but also between societies in the global south and in the global north. And only then we will achieve liberty not only for the few, but for all, as Karl Polanyi stated, in a perspective of global justice. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Miriam, and I immediately hand over to Ian.
Well, it's a tall order to talk about these two massive and very dense papers, and excellent papers, in 10 minutes, but I'll try. The Ulrich Brand et al. Paper starts off with three good questions. How are concerns for planetary developments related to territorialized policy spaces? Second, how devise policy spaces for collectively defined self-limitation? And third, how to situate this within global capitalism? And I'm completely with these three questions. They frame my own book, recent book, Heat, Greed and Human Need. In fact, there's a lot of similarities in all this. The answers to these three questions, seems to me, is that first of all, we require some universal normative frame in order to relate the global and the territorial. Secondly, we need a mechanism for collective self-determination. And thirdly, we need a realist model of the political economy, bringing capitalism back in. But now I realize I'm only talking about 1 and 2 and dodging the really tricky one, which is 3. How does this all relate to capitalism? But still, let me start off talking about a universal normative frame. And the question is asked by the article, can this be done without imposing universal paradigms that absorb or condition other worldviews? That's a very good question. So one of the interesting things is the appendix to the paper on these pluriverse alternatives, which was all new to me and very helpful. And I looked through those, and it seemed to me that these alternatives all had sort of suggest 3 main themes. First of all, a strong interrelation between individual and collective well-being. You can't separate off the individual. Second, that well-being also comprises all non-human elements. That came through strongly. Other species, nature, geography, weather, the planet. And so that was a second theme. And a third theme was that alternative forms of collective determination are needed beyond Western democracy. Now, the first and the third of those I'm completely in agreement with, but I wanted to spend a minute or two on the second one, the notion that well-being comprises all non-human elements. This is the idea of non-human needs, which I've come across before, and which accords an intrinsic status for the preservation of nature, irrespective of its contribution to human welfare. That I find problematic. I mean, if you're not giving priority to humans over other organisms, you might indeed give priority to non-human needs over human needs. That I find extremely worrying. And so my book, and our early book, does not prioritize the value of nature over the value of human needs. Now, I'm aware that this goes against the grain today, and there's a lot of writing, for example, on consciousness, arguing that all of nature is conscious. I find this extremely difficult to accept. So that's perhaps something we can discuss. Our theory of human need, the one with Len Doyle, is similar also to Nussbaum's notion of common capacities. And I still want to argue that human needs provides the only, I think, universal frame there is. I mean, one hint here is that it always comes up in the language. People talk about universal, about human needs. It's impossible, in fact, to discuss any of this, I think, without using the word needs. And I'm talking about needs as a goal here, and not needs as an end. So we have a sort of, our approach is, well, what are those requirements necessary to people to pursue any notion of well-being in any cultural context? And we adopt a sort of Kantian way of getting at this. Nussbaum has an Aristotelian method. But I think that there's a lot of similarity here, and we come up with similar core needs: participation or affiliation, 1, health or bodily integrity, 2, and autonomy or practical reason, 3. And that some agreement on this is necessary to avoid moral relativism, which troubled Polanyi too. And that relativism can undermine even the science of climate change, as we see in the US, parts of the US and Brazil and elsewhere. So we have a notion of critical autonomy here, which is where understanding extends beyond the cultural frame. And I found Charles Taylor, the Canadian philosopher, very interesting on this. He says there's a general trend towards a relatively greater respect for human beings one by one at the expense of previously recognized forms of social encapsulation. To be able to understand this sympathetically is to have a truer grasp of the human condition than that of people for whom alternative ways are utterly inconceivable. The step is an epistemic gain. People may be unhappier as a result, and may lose something valuable that only unreflecting encapsulation gives you. But none of that would make this encapsulation any the less blind. That's what we're trying to get at, I think, in the notion of critical autonomy, stepping outside the frame and understanding others. So that's a few comments on universalizable human needs. And then the second theme is collective self-limitation, identifying, which I would say is about identifying sustainable need satisfiers. The distinction between needs and need satisfiers is common in all need theory, as far as I'm aware. But so to determine specific need satisfiers requires some form of dialogue, we argue, between codified knowledge and experiential knowledge, what we call the dual strategy. There's some parallels here with the notion of non-canonized knowledges, but I think it's different. And I'm struck by some examples here, the climate assemblies, mainly in rich countries, which I think is an early example of territorialized collective self-limitation. It's a fascinating thing, but the climate assemblies in France and in the UK and elsewhere draw together a random sample of people who, after 6 or 9 months of dialogue with experts as well, come up with a consensus on a series of restrictions on consumption in Western countries. I think we need to pay more attention to that. Now, turning to Andreas Novy's paper, and much less on this, I'm afraid. How am I doing for time? Is this all right?
More minutes, yeah.
This fascinating idea of the foundational economy based on planetary coexistence. And this is seen as the alternative in the new trilemma, if that's the right phrase now, to liberal globalism and nationalistic capitalism. And you speak, Andreas, of entangled territorialized forms of self-determination. I guess the entangled bit is working out how this relates at the planetary level. And of course, I agree with this. I've written and argued that the foundational economy idea is closely associated with universal basic services, which some of us are arguing for, and both are, I think, compatible with the notion of needs in our theory of human needs. So the essential common elements here are that need satisfiers are non-substitutable. That's very important. Education is not the same as housing, which is not the same as child rearing, and so on and so forth. So UBI is not a way forward. UBS, Universal Basic Services, which recognizes those differences, is important. And the foundational economy fits in very well here as a disaggregated zonal model of the economy, where the foundational bit provides essential goods and services and infrastructures. So I think that's a very important step forward. But how can we link this back to global societal boundaries? Can the foundational economy frame extend beyond cultural and developmental context? And here I have my doubts, because the frame that I've read is based on Sen's capability approach, which rejects any clear conception of universalizable needs. And yet universalizability is seen as the defining feature of sustainability, and also nowadays of new discussions on sufficiency. So I think there's a continuing danger of moral relativism here in distinct place-based habitations. So how are Western consumers to take account of the planetary limits which are now so pressing? Can planetary coexistence be built in without some notion of universalizable needs and critical autonomy? And here, of course, we're faced by these vast gulfs, global inequalities, in living standards and in emissions. You all know the figures on this, I'm sure. That present consumption in the UK, consumption emissions is 12 tonnes per person per year, but we need to head to a global allowance of less than 1 tonne per person per year. There is a nice alternative approach, which I don't think is recognised in these two papers, pioneered by Narasimha Rao, of looking at material needs satisfiers and thresholds for each of those on a global basis. And he looks at nutrition, shelter, hygiene, clothing, healthcare, education, communication, information and mobility. And comes up with, I think, very interesting concepts and empirical measures of what these would mean. And then you have the research of Julia Steinberger and others in Leeds and in Switzerland, which works out, can we meet this sort of minimal standard of living from an energy perspective on a world scale and not contravene planetary boundaries? And they find that this can be done for a population of 10 billion people, but it would require cuts of up to 95% by the highest energy consumers. And so this is where one of the areas where we're talking, I suppose, about ought means can. Ought means can. Can we do this? The Lilly research and others show that yes, we can. But there's another sort of can, which is the political can. Can we, in the global capitalist system we have and the market logic we have, and the popularity of much of this, can this be done? But I'm afraid I'm going to cop out of discussing this. It's I suppose the most interesting question, except to end on a moment of doubt. I'm not sure that Polanyi can help here. Andreas says the great transition helps understand the interwoven dynamics of long-term transformations and short-term political ruptures. Well, that's what I need to be convinced about. The long-term transformations, yes. But how that ties in to short-term political ruptures and struggles for power in geopolitics is a much more difficult question for me. So on that sort of rather doubtful note I end, but I hope I've tried to be positive throughout. Okay?
Thank you very much, Ian. Difficult task for you, but thank you. To be precise, and I hand over immediately to Colleen for her first input.
Yeah, great, thank you very much. And so I'll take a bit of a different tact here than Ian and Miriam had, but maybe in some way contribute to what Ian mentioned as a realist model of political economy through a critical macrofinance lens. And the Brand et al. Paper talks generally through most of it about, in the context of societal boundaries, about what the collective is or what society is. And at the end of the paper comes more concretely to the nation state and very justifiably problematizes this as a container to work through, but also makes the point that working through it is necessary and working to transform the shape of it is necessary. So what I'd like to do is discuss the policy space of the state through the lens of the monetary system, the space that the state has to use money as a tool, and how that space is shaped by the globalized system of financial capitalism. And I'll do this to some extent more for high-income countries, and then bring in the international monetary system, the relation between currencies and high and low-income countries near the end if there's time. So my intention isn't to pit an interventionist state against the forces of finance, but to take a more nuanced look at the power dynamics within the public and private sectors of the monetary system and consider what this implies for the project of social ecological transformation working through the container of the nation state. And why focus on money? Well, because our starting point is capitalism, which, pulling off the definition again in the Brand et al. Paper, is a monetary economy of production, where the monetary system is an institution that mediates investment, the capacity to mobilize wage labor, and to transform nature. And money is social power. Money is also a marker of faith between the holder and the monetary sovereign that guarantees its value. It's a social contract, and this is an idea I'll come back to, this idea of a social contract. A central authority is able to issue money to pay for goods and services necessary to provision the state and take that money back out of circulation through taxation. And monetary sovereignty is importantly tied to ideas of collective identity and collective agency. It's people and place-based. Now, coming back to money as a tool of the state, the real limit on government spending is the productive capacity of the domestic economy and the regenerative capacity of the natural environment. So politically constructed limits on public debt constrain the ability of the state to treat its sovereign currency as a public good. So to say, it artificially constrains the space we have to work with for developing societal boundaries, right? It's putting an artificial boundary around that. As Keynes said, we can afford anything we can actually do. And this understanding was clear during World War II, and we can see this again now during COVID. And I think this understanding of fiscal policy space makes budgetary decisions more significant. It makes it clear that how money is spent is a political, not a financial decision. If we can afford anything we can actually do, then the question of what we actually try to do, how we try to do it, and whether we can succeed are pressing and contentious questions. Going beyond the domestic sphere, effective monetary sovereignty is the ability of states to make meaningful and directed choices to achieve their aims within a global credit money system. And this shapes in what ways and with what restraints society can provision itself. So I'm going to share my screen here for a second. So you should see this, and hopefully it's in presentation mode. And yes, all right, great, thank you.
Yes.
So just quickly here, it's kind of the pyramid of money. Yeah, so we have state money at the top, which is direct liabilities of the government sector. Bank issued credit money is clear. I think everyone knows about this. Market-based credit money I'll come to in a moment. And effective monetary sovereignty, maybe I shouldn't have put arrows on the top and bottom of this. I don't mean to say that it's directional here, but rather I meant to just show that it's a sliding scale. It's not a yes or no thing. Right? This is a scale, and different nations fall at different places on this at different times. And it's shaped by the monetary regime of the state and the relationship between the state and the lower two layers. And since the 19th century, a social contract has been in place between governments and banks, where central banks guarantee the validity of bank-created money to a limit, and the banking system concedes certain regulatory restrictions and provides certain services. And through this arrangement, public trust in the government is extended to the banking system. So this is what I mean here by the limited guarantee through an explicit social contract on the right-hand side. The depoliticizing of money tied to neoliberalism distorts the public good nature of the monetary system, including through limiting banking regulations, through disembedding the actions of the central bank from the broader goals of the government, and neutering fiscal policy through debt scaremongering. So think austerity politics. And central banks play a really key role in this, in propping up the financial system and in sustaining capitalism's systemic growth dependence, especially since the Great Financial Crisis. They act as first responders in economic crises and are arguably the most important economic policymaking agencies right now. At the same time, they're understood as being independent from the elected branch of government, and independence justified by the logic that they abide narrowly by a technocratic mandate. But this independence isn't some optimal arrangement. It's the institutionalized version of a power struggle that has been dominated by the financial sector since the early 80s. And I'll come to our lowest layer of here, the broadest base of money, shadow money, meaning money that's created through the financing of sale of securities outside of any explicit contract with the state. And this has become ubiquitous, generating massive financial profits and systemic instabilities. And this is what drove the Great Financial Crisis. So we're now in an arrangement where central banks rely on deep and liquid, which means large and powerful, financial markets to transmit monetary policy. So they need them further to transmit their own monetary policy. And in turn, financial markets rely on central banks to maintain an effective price floor on a growing pool of assets. So in this, we can see that this is the state de-risking systemic liabilities for financial market actors. It's an implicit social contract that has distinct distributional and environmental consequences. Quantitative easing, for example, is a critical part of this, and it's now quite clear that quantitative easing provides disproportionate financial support to carbon-intensive companies and sectors, and more generally increases wealth inequality. And central bank balance sheets jumped due to these asset purchases to QE during COVID response measures, compensating for politically imposed fiscal restrictions, right? So this is monetary policy having to be more active to compensate for limits on fiscal policy. And really interestingly, this past spring, we came close to having a run on treasuries, so US government bonds, which would have caused banks to sell off assets and precipitated a massive financial crisis. And to ensure that this didn't happen, that these bonds maintained their value and their role as a global safe asset, the Fed, the US central bank, stepped in and began purchasing bonds, so more QE at an unprecedented rate. And this was an order of magnitude greater than what they had done during the Great Financial Crisis. So 1 million in assets per second and over 80 billion in a day. And maybe this sounds like a good thing, like central banks are exercising the full power and force of the monetary system, but in whose name and to what end? If we're talking about policy space for genuine social ecological transformation, policy needs to have the capacity to drive meaningful change to our systems of production and provisioning, to labor relations, and to class hierarchies. And what's happening now with finance and monetary policy is hugely different than what had been the status quo, but it's done to maintain the existing social hierarchy, to maintain the project of neoliberalism. It's a case of everything must change so that it can stay the same, so to say. So how is it possible that we have this situation of what Daniela Gabor calls a revolution without revolutionaries? And it's because central banks feel confident that this power that they're exercising, these tools that they're using, won't be captured by forces of a radical political revolution, that the insulation of central banks from the rest of government, their independence that began in the 80s and was strengthened throughout the 90s and rather spread throughout much of the world, was done to ensure just that, to ensure this level of insulation. This is also why I think focusing on greening monetary policy misses the broader power dynamics at play. While it's necessary, it's also wholly insufficient. And if done without broader changes, it's just a green growth fix that sustains the power of finance. Instead, as the Brand et al. Paper points out, we must target institutions, power relations, and growth logic, and not focus on technocratic fixes. So what institutional regulatory structure would be necessary for the monetary system to facilitate social ecological transformation or to operate as a public good? And these are just a few proposals. This is not at all comprehensive. And how am I doing on time? So I'll just quickly maybe talk about a couple of these. There's also the point in the paper that setting societal boundaries requires deep democratic legitimacy. And I think a very important part of this is monetary democracy. And there's different ways that we do that. One is the coordination of monetary and fiscal policy, being explicit about the environmental and distributional consequences of both monetary and fiscal policy, and making these subject to democratic debate and oversight. In terms of credit regulation, understanding credit as endogenous is emerging out of our social needs. We see that credit allocation is a political act. Let's see. In terms of aggregate pump priming, or I would rather that we need directed fiscal spending in place of aggregate pump priming. So our goal isn't to just grow the economy, pump money in, and a rising tide floats or raises all ships, so to say. This is not at all what we need. We need to shift spending to systems that meet democratically decided upon goals and away from those that don't, which includes spending on decommodified systems such as Social Security and universal basic services. In terms of debt ceilings, the EU's Stability and Growth Pact is on pause at the moment to give member nations room to deal with the economic impacts of COVID. And there's debate about when this will be reinstated, if this should be reinstated. I would argue that we need a different alternative altogether, and that this politically imposed ceiling is detrimental to attempts of member nations to institute any genuinely transformative policy around the climate crisis. And you might wonder why I have job guarantee on here, in part because I think understanding that the state has the capacity to mobilize domestic resources means it also has the capacity to mobilize labor. And also because if we're thinking about how to degrow the financial system and minimize harm to the real economy, the job guarantee is actually a really powerful tool here to cushion any negative effects for the working class. And also because a decentralized and democratically administered job guarantee provides capacity to build out the foundational economy on the community level, focusing on labor-intensive sectors. So I think this is actually a really key thing. Yeah, and then I wanted to discuss a bit around currency and ecological and social and racial hierarchies and how are these intertwined, but I'll just finish by saying that the great financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and now COVID have shown us that political constraints are more elastic than many people had previously imagined. A progressive politics that wants to resist the affinities of conservatism or authoritarianism needs to get really comfortable with the depth of government agency and the choice that implies. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Colleen. Thank you very much, all the three discussants. I want to start with you, Colleen, and then continue with the others. Simply to ask, given your presentation, what would be key links to the other two presentations?
Yeah. I mean, I had actually, maybe I'll just, so I had the next slide was money as a public good in the international system. And I think there's constraints that we can put around international flows of money that would allow for the global south or lower income countries to some extent break these cycles that they're forced into because of ecologically unequal exchange and because, you know, the imperial mode of living is built upon extraction of resources and labor and wealth in the global south. I think regulating shadow banking is a huge part of this. I think open systems of central bank swap lines is a part of this. I think capital controls are absolutely critical in allowing for some level of autonomy for the global south, as well as debt forgiveness, which was argued for at the onset of COVID and didn't really go anywhere meaningful. But I think this is something that is an important conversation to have, and there's a lot of good to be done in pushing that conversation towards debt forgiveness. You know, I could also go back to Keynes's Bretton Woods proposal for clearing unions, and maybe even if it's not an international clearing union, having systems of multilateral clearing unions, even, you know, within global south countries that would do a lot again to kind of break this subjugated position they're forced into in terms of the international monetary system. And I'd be curious to hear what Miriam thinks of those ideas. On Ian's, honestly, I find it a bit harder to make a direct connection.
Because I copped out of the last question about the relationship with capitalism. So
yeah, so then maybe this is a connection there. I'm making some attempt to address that last question.
As you were asked, Miriam, I would ask you to join, and then Ian.
Okay, I was saying I actually pretty much agree with what Colleen is proposing for a transformation of the international finance system.
Ian, perhaps.
Well, I thought I liked that paper very much, Colleen. I must read it, and also your options at the end, which seem to be relatively more conventional. You made one point saying that the shadow money system maintains carbon-intensive sectors. If you could just explain why they would particularly favour carbon-intensive, that would be good. But I suppose the big question is still how do we get from here to there? What you're proposing seems it's really valuable, but I'd need to know how this is going to happen in the global capitalist system we have at present. I guess you're arguing that there is actually a shift away from austerity and controls over debt, which is loosening up the international financial system.
So I actually said that quantitative easing favors more carbon-intensive sectors, and this is largely because it follows a principle of market neutrality. So the sectors and companies that have the most, say, bonds to sell out on the market are the ones that are just necessarily going to benefit the most from asset purchase programs. And there's a number of reasons why big fossil fuel companies tend to be more in this bucket, but they clearly benefit more from this. How do we get there is an interesting question. And I think we're actually in this very interesting period where this hegemonic idea of central banks as necessarily being independent and apolitical and technocratic, this is breaking down. Yeah, this started to break down during the Great Financial Crisis, and it's really, really being tested as an idea now in COVID. And I think this is important, and it gives us space to push on this, to push on the ideas of what the mandate is, what the role of the central bank is. Also, for example, to the point you mentioned, Ian, of where the way we talk about and understand debt is changing, that the Stability and Growth Pact was paused, and that there is debate going on about what should be done with this. So I think with the crises we've seen, this is putting us in a place where there's a battle to be had around some of these points. It's not a given, but there is a battle to fight there.
Just one before I hand over to Miriam, just one, because it's so in the public debate now, and relating to Miriam's concern. Take El Salvador with going to bitcoins. Is it possible to have collectively defined self-limitation in the global south without some type of monetary sovereignty, Colleen?
So, I mean, the global south has some level of effective monetary sovereignty, but much less than the global north. And these proposals that I mentioned before in response to Miriam were intended to increase the level of effective monetary sovereignty for the global south. And I would argue that needs to happen to be in a space where you can collectively, democratically, politically establish these societal boundaries.
Thank you. Miriam?
Okay, yeah, I think 2 points. One is that I think it is urgent to repoliticize debt, not only in terms of debt forgiveness, but also in terms of recognition of historical debts and ecological debts and colonial debts. There have been calculations, for example, how much Britain would owe India in terms of paying back what has been extracted from there and reestablishing just relations. And maybe, yeah, I think it would help, of course, a lot if we would reframe that in this sense. I was thrilled when I learned that if in the context of the COVID crisis, when the German government issues government bonds, it has zero costs. When the Ecuadorian government issues government bonds, they have to pay like 15%. Yeah, so even in the small corridor of trying to get some liquidity to attend the crisis, there is still an inbuilt injustice. And this is related to how we politicize debt, I think, and how, of course, international finance systems are framed and work. An interesting debate for me is also how we can maybe increase monetary sovereignty by creating different monies for different purposes, as Alf Hornborg states this, who criticizes very much this general purpose money, which is always convertible. And there are lots of places in the world where you have those local currencies, which are more social currencies, which are deliberately used to strengthen local economies and local exchange. So we could maybe think in a direction that allows us to have different currencies at different scales, which have limited purposes and are one inside the other, and only a limited currency for global interactions. And that would be a good protection against some international unequal dynamics, I think. So much to Colleen from my side.
Yes, I would also thank you for the contributions and the important thoughts. We refer briefly in the paper to, I'm the facilitator, I won't make any contribution. We refer briefly to money, and Alf Ronbock was also in the original writing group, then he stepped back due to time reasons. But I find it a very good example, Colleen, that you add and you complement with your thoughts and what we want to do, and that we get into this discussion. And you showed also the power of finance in the current greening of capitalism in the global north, with all the negative aspects in the global south Miriam was referring to. But then you also say we need to degrow the financial system. And you have some ideas, but I'm currently in Berlin. And in Berlin, we have in 2 weeks a referendum on the societalization or reappropriation, if you like, of real estate, of massive real estate here in Berlin. And so is degrowing the financial system also socializing the means of production? Is this part of your let's say, of a possible strategy? And then linking it to Ian's question, how to link short-term and long-term struggles. We refer in our paper very much to, of course, Henri Gortz and Ivan Illich, and Gortz coined the term in the 1970s of the non-reformist reforms. Or I work with the concept of radical reformism, coined by Joachim Hirsch and others. So how to bring together in your fields or in the manifold fields very concrete reforms which lead to a radical social ecological transformation, which cannot be co-opted by a greening of the financial system, by offsetting, by a greening of consumption, the individualization of responsibility, which is in the consumption debate so strong, but really to lead to radical societal change. Maybe you can elaborate on this a bit against the background of your experiences.
Yes, well, that's you put it very well. That's what needs to be thought about: radical reformism, and we have the example of universal basic services, which I think is coming up the agenda, and is a way of collectivizing the provision of certain essential goods and services in a way which is extremely redistributive. There's nothing like providing health and education for free. Even if you have a very bad taxation system, it's very redistributive. And I'm finding more and more information that it's also more sustainable. The carbon footprint of the US healthcare system is 300% greater than that in Europe. So this is a very good example of the way in which collective provision can also be more sustainable. So that's one concrete sort of radical reform. And then we're also working on the notion of maxima. How can we get agreement on some notion of sufficiency, which entails caps on wealth and income and consumption. And this is something I'm going to be looking at with a grant I've got from the Leverhulme Foundation to look at what we mean by sufficiency and to try and operationalize this. So that's what I'm thinking about now. And there is a move towards this. There's an awareness that luxury consumption is harmful to the planet and harmful to society, so we can work on that. There's increasing recognition, I think, by states that there are certain forms of labour which are essential. The British government has made a list of essential workers. Extraordinary. We haven't had that since the Second World War. And they're the usual list of workers, which you'd expect. But hedge fund managers don't figure there, and tax accountants and so forth. So I think a debate is now occurring on what's essential and what's unproductive. It's a return to the older debates on productive and unproductive labour, which I was very interested in from a Marxist perspective all those years ago. it's a return to thinking about necessities and luxuries, and it's a return to thinking about minimum incomes and riches. I think there's a scope for, and these all contribute to this notion of self-limitation, do they not?
Colleen, I think there was a question to you as well.
Yeah, well, maybe I'd touch on what Miriam asked about. She brought this idea, like Alf Homburg's proposal, how to turn an ocean line paper on complementary currencies, and this idea of local currencies. And I think this is really interesting and an important thing to look at. If we look historically, right, systems of tiered currencies were the norm. However, since in the last several hundred years, basically since the dominance of capitalism, we've generally speaking had the rule of one nation, one currency. The EU is obviously an interesting exception to this, but there's also some things that are problematic in the construction of it because of this, yeah. And I brought up this point of monetary sovereignty being tied to ideas of collective identity and agency, and then so I wonder about the capacity to have local currencies, for example, city level currencies that would operate alongside a national level currency, and what this would mean for a collective sense of identity. And I'm not sure where this goes. I'm not sure how this would play out, but I think it's an interesting possibility in terms of a step in deglobalization, so to say. Willie, you asked about socializing means of production and how this relates to degrowing finance. And Ian, I think you touched an important point of this when you talked about healthcare. And then Uli, with what's going on with Deutsche Wohnen in Berlin is actually a great example of this, because real estate in particular is obviously everyone is very, very tied to financial markets, right? This is one of the things that when QE is happening and central banks are flooding markets with liquidity, this liquidity then goes into real estate and into stock markets, inflating real estate prices. So there's absolutely an important connection there between socializing these things and saying that this is something that we think everyone should have access to, and we don't want access to it subject to the whims of asset price fluctuations that will necessarily be a part of challenging the way the financial system works now.
Tell us about it. I'm sitting here in central London. I can see it.
This is where I appreciate being in Vienna.
Yeah, the ownership of land is crucial. That has to come up the agenda.
Thank you. There are a few questions in the Q&A section, and two relate to democracy and whether and how majorities are willing, able to impose limits. Perhaps that's a question to all. And the second set of question, or is this question on Universal Basic Services Foundational Economy, that goes probably strongly to Miriam, in the sense of whether you consider these concepts that are relevant in Latin America as well, and in how far. And the final of these open questions is the role and impact of racism on inequalities and uneven consumption.
Maybe I could start. I think with regard to democratic procedures for self-limitation and how these can work, there is really a lot to learn from all the experiences of the government of the commons around the world, where actually such processes of self-limitation are happening. You have a specific collective of people relating to specific commons, which have to limit their use of that for the commons to perdure and to be sustainable. And it generally works out very well. And maybe it would be interesting to look into not only the work of Elinor Ostrom in this regard, but also into the work that tries to make visible how communitarian politics work like again in the Global South, bringing forward a different kind of doing politics, which is not delegating decision-making power to representatives. And there, the self-limitation seems to work very well in a democratic manner. To translate this to urban societies of the North is obviously a challenge, and I am finding that your work, Ian, on the caps on wealth, income, and consumption, which would be regulated from state instances, is very important. But also, I think in this context of self-limitation, we have also to revive the notion of freedom, of how can we avoid being constantly induced into new wants, which is actually happening, and how it is not so much about having less, but about having been being forced less into constant consumption, thinking that this is what quality of life is about. And my discussion with you, Ian, would be about around this, if like from these other modes of living, quality of life is not so much about having a list of needs and having a list of satisfiers, but really a more integral notion of, are my relations with my surroundings, with other people, with nature, with my ancestors, with the spiritual dimension of life, are they healthy? Are they in a good shape? This is what would make my life a good life. And my concern with the claim of universality of human needs, although I recognize that the differentiation between needs and satisfiers has helped a lot to make context-based differences possible, and this is a very important step, but still people like Boaventura de Sousa Santos say that Western culture is the only civilization in the world that has ever claimed to be universal. And we have had several attempts here in Ecuador to measure the success of buen vivir, like this alternative paradigm of good living, which is rooted in indigenous societies. Mm-hmm. And we found out that it's always, even if you differentiate between needs and satisfiers, you still impose a sort of metric mindset, which is very specific of Western modernity on those other worldviews. You still force them to count, to change the perspective on well-being, and are not really engaging in this trans-civilizational dialogue, which I think is relevant for our processes of social ecological transformation today. So I don't know if the risk is really moral relativism, or if the risk is pretending to be open to cultural difference, but still not understanding what the difference is about, and thus blocking our minds from entering a new understanding of how we could be in the world without overusing it all the time. Well, I don't know if I could make myself clear. And my last point would address this question about racism, if it is articulated sufficiently in the transition debates. Well, I think it is not. This is one of the weak parts of framing the transformation we need as social and ecological. And this is why we try to move toward a more multidimensional perspective on transformation, because the question of race and coloniality actually articulates all global relations. And this is rather not very visible neither in the policy proposals nor in the academic debates around social ecological transformation, I think. So bringing coloniality back in, and with this, alongside with this race, would be a task, I think, for many of us.
Well, can I have an answer? That you put that so well and cogently, Miriam, that it's knocked me back a bit. But I disagree with it, and I want to maintain this notion of a minimal set of requirements for people to be able to pursue any worldview. It's almost the opposite. It's not. We're not in the business of specifying what are desirable for worldviews and what's the view on nature and commons and so on. We're trying to abstract government and states from all that. It's saying what are the necessary prerequisites for people to pursue any particular view of well-being, and if we don't have that, then how can we get any notion of a just and fair allocation of resources on a world scale? We need some metric. But I don't think there's anything wrong with in metrics per se, to establish what can we do on a world scale when the population is going to be 9 or 10 billion people, and these huge inequalities. I know there's many other valuable things. We had a 5-year project on well-being in developing countries, which recognised all that diversity. But what is the floor to enable people to pursue those distinct goals? That's the crucial aim of needs. And I do think that any discussion of these issues will in the end come back to saying, okay, but people do really need some form of shelter which protects them from the elements and so forth. Of course, that's material needs. Also, children need some degree of security in order to develop a stable psyche and so forth. On democracy, there was another question from the audience, but do we want to continue with this? Or?
Continue on democracy first, yeah?
Well, yes, does a competitive form of democracy in an ultra-competitive and hyper-consumption society make it easy to impose limits? No, of course it doesn't. There's competition, as these papers say, for people to accumulate and enjoy the various want satisfiers, the increasing number of want satisfiers that are produced. So democracy is a very poor way, I think, of establishing these self-limitation, which can lead you in two directions. One is that you reduce democracy, and I think some examples of what China's doing is quite interesting here in self-limiting. For example, access to bad stuff on the internet. I don't know. I don't want really to get into that. And the other avenue is to complement at least competitive democracy with dialogic democracy along the lines which I think we both agree.
There is, just to add on you, that you continued, as Peter Cox asked, Ian mentioned that thinking about sufficiency required us to consider needs and limits, but I missed the key point. Could you elaborate?
Well, I mean, there's an interesting debate going on. What is a sufficient lifestyle? I think the only way we can get at this is that sufficiency is a space between a minimum and a maximum. The minimum is provided by need theory and adequate satisfiers and institutions in any particular social context. The maximum, in the age of the Anthropocene, must be we must start with these planetary boundaries and then formulate them, as you say, as societal boundaries. And there's lots of interesting work going on here, which we could talk about, but perhaps not now.
Thank you. And there is another question to you, Colleen. Have you read it by Benjamin?
I did indeed read it, so I can address that. Well, I'll briefly say it so everyone knows that who are the agents we need to address if we strive for a revolution of the monetary system and purposeful degrowth of the financial system. And you wrote that seems they're hardly under democratic control, this is what I was talking about in regard to central banking, is this lack of democratic accountability, but also why this is an interesting point in time to pursue this project of politicizing money more generally and specifically monetary policy. So the agents we need to address, this in some sense it matters to where we're talking about, the US or the EU or where we're talking about here, but politicizing the ECB, for example, I think this happens through kind of increasing popular awareness around this, and then groups pushing on this and working on this, and then also within the EU, it's going to matter what national governments want and try and push for, which is to some extent going to be shaped by what their national constituencies want or how they understand this problem. Like obviously Germany has a particularly strong role in this case. There's also the idea of public banking systems. So the Labour Party, Corbyn's Labour Party, had a really extensive and well done proposal for a multi-tiered public banking system. And so this being part of a political platform that then gets traction is a way to, concretely move towards a more democratic monetary system. There's also space for this within the Green New Deal. The European Green Deal, doesn't have elements of this. This is, very much a green growth strategy, but like Sanders' plan in the US, for example, does have elements of this. So basically, the financial and climate crises that we are in the midst of create opportunities to push for politicizing money.
I would like to push a bit the debate with a question to all of you. We try to understand better the notion of policy space. Andreas and others are working on beyond the dichotomy of nationalism and, let's say, naive cosmopolitanism. And so Andreas and many others argue it must be more flexible and more permeable, let's say, a politics of scale, that we have to look really where our emancipatory achievements are possible. I would like to push, and also against the background of the current debate, what is the polity? What are the very structures of policy making? What are the governance structures in a more recent term? So how can we understand and how can we conceptualize against the background of your research to give achievements of social ecological transformation, consumption corridors, the maximum, the control of capital, etc., etc. What are the mechanisms to, in the let's say medium term? What are the mechanisms to secure them? Because I found it so important that Miriam is arguing it's a constant back and forth of social ecological achievements, and then Bolsonaro comes in and the neoliberal rollback comes in. So how can we think the very structures, the very policy of, the very polity of social ecological transformations, which also might link to the question of democracy and others?
Thank you. That's very good, because I want to add on this, asking a question which is implicitly also trying to answer the question from Ian, what I meant by linking the short term and the long term, and what Polanyi did, linking the long term transformation towards a market economy to this disaster of the 1930s, of the breakdown of liberal capitalism. That's what's written in my article. But to translate it to our current situation and adding on Uli, I think, and that's in the announcement of the of this event, and I will simply read it again and to introduce it in the debate, is to look at more deeply into those who want to hinder such a transformation, and not only look at the agents in favor of it, but better understand those who hinder it. And here we have written, today it often lacks an answer to the challenge posed by adverse societal dynamics, be it majorities that reject limiting their consumption, enemies that obstruct cooperation and solidarity to achieve a good life for all, today increasingly present in diverse forms of reactionary politics. And how this relates to what Uli asked, in which concrete situation we are and what does this imply for potential progressive agency?
I suppose my concern is, can we come up with any answers to these enormous questions? What are the governance mechanisms for proceeding? They will emerge. Is this a cop-out? In practice, I'm not sure that any sort of route plan can really be laid down when we get to that level of governance. And I suppose that was also my concern about how far can we use Polanyi. I'm in the middle of reading Gareth Bale's intellectual biography of Polanyi, and I was struck by how the numerous intellectual currents and then the numerous crises and dangers that thrust themselves upon him. And though the great transformation is a wonderful distillation, I'm not sure there are many general lessons we can learn here. But anyway, someone else should come in to see if they can answer your very interesting questions more positively.
I don't know if I have a more positive answer, or if I could answer the question of what are the governance structures, other than to say that part of what I was doing in looking at the relationship between central bank and financial markets and this kind of two-way relation of infrastructural power was an attempt to better understand this particular governance structure. Yeah. And then in doing so, having a better understanding of how each relies on the others and the ways in which this plays out. Hoping that can shed some light on what a downscaling of this process, what form that might take. But in a broader sense, I also don't know that I have the answer to this question.
Have we lost Miriam? It looks as if. Huh?
I think so.
Yeah. Because then we are above 1.5 hours, and I think it's time for final words. And as we announced, Uli and myself will say a few words as well. But for you, Ian and Colleen, anything?
I would like
to summarize.
I would like to hear from you, Andreas and Ulrich. Say a few words on this.
Okay.
Yes, we just had, as I mentioned last week, our group Alternatives to Development in Latin America. It was during the whole week, and we discussed since 10 years the question of the state, which is usually the polity structure. And of course, when we think about governance, it's institutions around the state. And what was interesting, we also published, I wrote a paper with an article with Miriam, how to transform, como transformar, in a book in 2015, how to think alternative institutionalities, not going directly to the state. But we didn't go further. It's interesting that these are really the top thinkers, I would say, the critical thinkers of Latin America. And we don't have really answers. And our project is, with Miriam and others, to look as Ian says, to look at the current experiences, not to say we have a roadmap, but to look what are the concrete alternatives to stabilize, let's say, social, ecological, emancipatory achievements beyond the focus on the state. But, and this is very important, when we look at the corona pandemic, that the state will play a decisive role. So it would underestimate the power resources, for example, how to block diverging interests. With Andreas, we always say, how to live with assholes. Please forgive me this. how to live with powerful forces, which is a bit better said. It's nicer. And this is, I would say, also a research program to us, but to have in mind, and this is Andreas' contribution, and I would say this whole Polanyian discussion, that it's the false alternative, speaking with Adorno, to think only in the national scale or in the cosmopolitan international scale, but how to think these different scale to really secure emancipatory achievement. This is one final thought. The second one, and then I finish, is what I learned from the need satisfier debate, that we need to insist, and we do this in the paper, and Ian does it in his work, the debate on sustainability transformation, let's say the mainstream green debate, listening to the German debate now prior to the elections, is about consumption, about green growth, and the main actor is the consumer, and then of course green investment. But what is really out of sight, out of the debate, is really a mode of production and a mode of living, the really deep structures, how we are forced to live this, how we are forced at the production side and the consumption and the mode of living to reproduce constantly the imperial mode of production and living. And this is what we need to work on, but also we need to speak it out publicly, that the corridor of thinking, the Green Party now in Germany, it's such a narrow corridor of thinking alternatives in given the deep crisis. And I would say I take this with me from the debate, that we have to rethink it and to link it to the money question, which Colleen put up. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. From my point, it's a pity that Miriam is not here, because I think that her contribution was important, and at the same time, for me, it raised these old questions that I'm really concerned that so much movement and research on social ecological transformation puts faith in the organization of the like-minded, and she cited the Commons and other counter spaces, which I appreciate and I acknowledge that they are important aspects of alternatives. But I think the real challenge is exactly how to deal with those not liking the changes we have in mind, and the normative assumptions on the good life for all within planetary boundaries. And this implies, and that's why, in continuation of what Uli said, I think the state and coercive apparatuses are important, and they are unavoidable. Even if we don't like the police, the indigenous people in Brazil currently, they are desperate because nobody protects them against the invaders in their territory, and that's a deliberate strategy of the Bolsonaro government. So I think that's one point that I really think we should try to advance towards, as in continuation of what Uli said, dealing with the opponents, and using force to limit their destructive capacities. A little bit, that's what Colleen suggested in a less violent language with respect to the financial markets, asking for the limitation of power of hedge fund and investors and global capital. I was very happy that we introduced this the monetary debate, which, as we agree, is a little bit lacking in the social ecological transformation debate. And it enriches our understanding for universalizing. And here again, I think this universal needs, universal standards, universal basic services they are ambivalent. I acknowledge that Miriam insists here in diversity and the autonomous spaces of indigenous people, but other groups as well. Yeah? But on the same time, we need some notion of universality if we want to live together, yeah, and achieve strategies for all, because what is for all different from the universal. And in using your language, I think, Ian, it's quite obvious that the diversity and the democratic deliberation enters via the need satisfiers. And the need satisfiers, they are very context specific, and they are contested and democratically struggled for, and very different in urban and rural areas, etc., etc. But that's these two attempts, having common universal standards and understandings and having diverse ways of implementing it, that's part also of this multi-scalar strategy that we should use. And the foundational, the basic services, they have to be decided in decentralized ways. And I think that's exactly your concept of needs, and need satisfiers is a very good complement to our arguments for multi-scalar strategies, with different levels having different responsibilities and tasks. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think these were some key learnings from my side as well. And if nobody has any desire for a last intervention, this implies that we are coming to an end.
I'm happy with that summing up.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you, the audience. You want to, did you want to say something, Ian?
No, I wanted to thank you. It's a very stimulating discussion.
Yeah, but then thank you, the audience, who stayed with us for so long. Yeah, we'll write the summary just to announce this. That's what we agreed with the Luxembourg Foundation. We might come back to some of you discussants, and for sure we continue the debate, because Uli wants to have 28 co-authors, to have other events, other discussions, and that was just one of them. So all the best. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
From my side, thank you. It's great. Bye-bye.